My name is Commentator. I work at Chautari. We've assembled here to do a launch of the South Asian edition of Mark's latest book. It's called Far Out. This full title is Countercultural Seekers and the Tourist Encounter in Nepal. It was originally published in 2017 by the University of Chicago Press, which is if you believe in the publishers hierarchy, rankings, etc. in the US academic scene, it will be at the very top. In the blurb of the original book, the University of Chicago people describe this book as a lifetime's, as a result of Mark's lifetime love with Nepal. Mark first came to Nepal in 1969, that is 50 years ago, as a kid with his parents, and has been actively researching Nepal since the late 80s, when both he and I were graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania. He did his PhD in anthropology. The doctoral research was done in the year 1991, which resulted in the book Suitably Modern, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2003. And Martin Chautari reprinted that book in 2008. In 2010, we compiled, basically Mark compiled many of his essays which had been published in different publication platforms, and we published that book as out here in Kathmandu. This book, Mark has been working, as it says in the blurb, for a very long time. I myself read the first draft of this book in 2009, when he gave me a huge pile. The chapters were very long, and when this book was accepted by the University of Chicago Press, he was told to cut the original submitted manuscript into by 1/3.
40% actually.
40%. So what you actually see in the book that will be launched here today is 40% shorter than the original draft I did in 2009. As you will notice, some of the chapters that are made into this book were earlier published as articles in our journal, both which studies in Nepali history and society, which Mark and I founded back in 1995. The first issue was published in 1996, and our publisher, Mandala Book Points, Madhavji, is somewhere in the premises. Where is he? He's outside. In those incarnations, in the chapters, the longer versions were published. So you will find 3 of the chapters that are in the book. The longer versions exist in the journal. As you will notice, in one of the chapters, in the Nepali response to the hippies, the man sitting here as the chief guest today features over several pages. And like a lot of us, Mark benefited from Abhi Subedi's life experiences and knowledge in writing this book. There's another person sitting in the room whose knowledge of the hippie era Mark benefited a lot, and that's Mr. Prakash Heraj. You'll notice in some of the acknowledgement that Mark has written in this book, and in specific chapters, that specific pieces of information came from Prakash. It would be absolutely foolish on my part to introduce Abhi Subedi to you. I mean, Abhi Subedi has been an institution, a single person institution for most of my adult life. So I won't do that. Abhi was a professor of English at Tribhuvan University for a very, very long time. He retired from there officially, but he still teaches there. He writes columns in English and Nepali. And this is already the second program that he's now will be talking at. When I first invited him, he said he read my 5:15 as 3:15. Say, "Bhai, all you think time." Then he said, "Oh, 5:15 right now." So we're really blessed to have him here. A lot of us have benefited from his sound knowledge on this and that topic, and he's spoken at Martin Chautari on many, many occasions. The third person who will comment on the book today is Shradha Ghale, journalist, commentator, but most recently famous for her first novel, The Wayward Daughter, a Kathmandu story, which was published last year. We had a discussion based on that book here several months ago. मैले चाहिँ त्यो किताब पढेको छैन, पढ्छु है। I'll get that. उहाँले चाहिँ पढ्दै हुनुहुन्छ अरे। And so we all really wanted this program to be short, so that we will have more time for informal gofs later. I mean, usually we don't do this, but I suggested that we try it this time, which is to say, we actually package books in this form. I think we've never done this. We've never done this. So the first thing I will do is to ask all three of them to stand up and tear the pages, and that will count as the launch. PhD students, two of them in the history department, one of them in the anthropology department. These are Nepali colleagues. Two of them are sitting in this room. Avas Bhandari here, Dipti section outside. Avas in the history department, Dipti in the anthropology department, and Mark is their supervisor. They have not actually started their dissertations yet, but it's very interesting. In the other side of town in Chicago, there is Surabhi Pudaseni, enrolled in the history PhD program at the University of Chicago, who is also, hangs out with this group. So in some ways there is a Mark's commitment to Nepal, scholarship on Nepal, is also demonstrated by the fact that, as I said earlier, we founded this journal in '95, and he's been editing that since then with me and others for a very long time. We've thought of retiring as editors, but we haven't quite done that. We don't have a retirement date as of now. The volume 24, number 1 issue, came out just a few weeks ago, and it has a special section on what we've called the long 1950s. The earlier curriculum here today was related to what could be called archives in different parts of the world that will enable Nepalis and other historians of Nepal to write what could be called a global history of Nepal. So there are now archives in the US, in the UK, and other countries that are being freshly worked at. Nepali historians and historians of Nepal have worked at archives in Nepal, India, and the UK partially in the past. But the US archives in the US that Tom Robertson was talking about just before we began this program is now a gold mine for many historians. Mark, as I said, was first interested in the distinction of the middle class in Kathmandu in his first book. The second book was also related in many ways to that. The third book that is being launched here today is a long history of the tourist encounter related to Nepal. So Videsi imaginations about Nepal that brought them here, and Nepali response to that. He's also worked on the history of hydropower. That book might come out in the next 2-3 years, who knows? And then he has other interesting projects. So that's all I will say. Surma Eso Garam Kare, I had asked Shradha ji to actually comment on the book. She's actually reviewed this book for the Kathmandu Post, possibly early 2018. I don't remember the date. Surum 17 May, Nikline Bittigai. Comment चाहिँ कति मिनेटको गरौँ भनेर उहाँले हाम्रो कलिगहरुलाई सोध्नु भएको थियो। मैले चाहिँ 15 मिनेट दिँदै भइहाल्यो नि भनेको थिएँ। अब जति मिनेट दिन मन लाग्छ त्यति मिनेट दिने हो खास चाहिँ, है? सो कति मिनेट बोल्नुहुन्छ तपाईले बोल्नु।
I've read, although I hadn't read Mark until now, this very moment, I've read all his books, including his previous 2 books on modernity in Kathmandu and middle class in Kathmandu. Far Out is primarily a history of tourism in Nepal, in that it traces how Nepal became a destination for global tourism after it opened its doors in the 1950s. What makes this book really rich and fascinating is it not only recounts some really important and interesting events, but also explores some of the key ideas that shape tourism in Nepal, and also tells the stories of individuals who actually, the first individuals who propagated and were able to sell these ideas. And I think there are two broad questions. There are many things that the book does, but two broad questions that the book tries to address, I would say, is one is how have different generations of Westerners imagined Nepal over time, and two, and how have their imaginings shaped tourism in Nepal, or what Mark calls the encounter between Nepalis and foreigners. So in his analysis, tourism in Nepal has evolved through three distinct phases. The first was began in the 1950s, and because at the time it was still not easy for people to come to Nepal because it had just opened its doors. So few tourists were arriving here, and they were mostly well-connected and wealthy European and American elites. And for them, Nepal was this pristine land far from Western civilization, land of mountains and festivals and royal coronations and Yeti hunts. So in fact, the first proper hotel in Kathmandu, called the Royal Hotel, was established during this period by the legendary Boris Lisanovich. The book has a really fascinating chapter on Boris, where it talks about how this Russian guy who used to manage a club in Calcutta came to Nepal and became the father of tourism under King Tribhuvan's patronage. In the second phase, actually I should add, what about Nepalis though during this phase? This was a very early phase of tourism. So interestingly, for Nepalis, tourism was still a very alien concept back then. They couldn't understand why foreigners would come here and why they would want to see mountains and rural life and things like festivals and temples, because for them, these things were just impediments to modernity and progress. So the book has some really amusing and insightful passages that show how Nepalis gradually learned to wrap their heads around Westerners' fantasies. And soon enough, they learned how to turn those fantasies into money-making ventures. So those passages are really interesting, I think. So the next phase of tourism, which Mark calls the Hippy Age, spanned the mid-60s through early 70s. So it was, in the West, it was the time of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and many middle class youth wanted to, were disenchanted with their society and wanted to rebel against the consumerism and warmongering that afflicted their societies. So these youth found a perfect escape in what Mark describes as the exotic, cannabis-friendly, cheap and welcoming streets of Kathmandu. And this is just one example of how vividly the book evokes the atmosphere of 70s Kathmandu. And in fact, I think the section on hippie tourism is the heart of the book, and probably the most interesting. And there was one very striking feature of this phase of tourism, and it was that it was the lower caste Nepalis and not the elites, not the Nepali elites, who actually catered to these hippies, because they were free from notions of purity and caste-related, like other caste-related taboos. These locals were able to turn their homes, like very simple, basic homes, into low-budget low-budget restaurants and lodges for these tourists who were mostly young and broke and were traveling on a shoestring budget. So it was a very different kind of tourism. And when you read this, it's hard not to look back with some kind of nostalgia, just because of how much things have changed. And this age, the hippie age, actually began to fade sometime around the mid-70s, because by then the countercultural, this anti-establishment spirit of the 60s had begun to wane, and it was being replaced by pretty conservative and consumerist values. For instance, in 1973, the Nepal government banned marijuana under international pressure. And the Nepali government was eager to keep up with the dominant global ethos, and so they started to get rid of these hippies, these scruffy, dirty, kind of broke young people, and in order to promote a different kind of tourism. And now the new kind of tourism the government wanted to promote was targeted at richer and cleaner, more well-heeled foreigners. So this is what led to the birth of adventure tourism. And for this type of tourism, Nepalis were able to cash in on a readily available resource, and that was Westerners' infatuation with mountains. The book does an excellent job of showing us that this mania for mountains is not a natural thing, but a socially and historically constructed phenomenon. Because it reminds us that there was a time when mountains were actually feared and detested for being empty and barren and dangerous terrain. And even actually the very idea of climbing a mountain for pleasure was unthinkable. It was only towards the 19th century, in the Romantic era especially, that mountains, as Westerners and people in the West started becoming disenchanted with modernity or modern life, that mountains started being portrayed as an antidote to the ills of Western civilization. You can see, if we look back at 19th century literature and poetry, you can see how mountains were starting, people were starting to perceive mountains differently. And for those who were looking to cure those ills of Western civilization, there could be no grander destination than the remote Himalayas. Now these mountains symbolize not just physical courage, but also moral and spiritual purity. So Nepal skillfully tapped into this desire and rebranded its mountains into trekking areas. And actually it was during the 70s that the government created all these national parks and reserves where wealthy tourists could experience nature and wilderness. Now the heyday of the Freak Street was over, and Tamil actually emerged as the hub of Nepali tourism during this time. And gradually there was like a full-scale service economy featuring trekking companies, gear shops, and mountain flight operators. The number of trekkers and mountaineers multiplied each year. There was a lot of coverage. All these adventures received a lot of coverage in Western media, and some of these people also went back and wrote best-selling books and made movies about these adventures. So another interesting point that the book makes is how these adventure tourists differed from the hippies. Actually, they differed in a crucial way. Again, I can't help quoting the author here because there are so many passages in this book that I won't quote. So he writes, "A trek is something one not only does, but crucially buys. Unlike the hippies, trekkers came to Nepal in search of a commercial service, meaning adventure. So these trekkers were more cautious, less open to conversation, more afraid of being cheated, and seemingly less curious. There was also another difference. which is that hippies had little money but lots of time. So they could, they could just hang about and laze around, mix with locals. They had to walk all over the city because there was not much public transportation back then. And in contrast, these adventure tourists were cash rich but time poor. So meaning they wanted to squeeze out maximum experience within the shortest possible time. And the surest way to do this was to buy experience in packaged form. So this is how the face of tourism gradually changed. There's another category of adventure tourists that the book examines, and which is equally interesting, and they are the dharma tourists, foreigners who came looking for spiritual experience in an exotic landscape. So instead of spending money on trekking agencies and guides, these dharma tourists spend money on meditation retreats and like lamas and gurus. So both the trekkers and dharma tourists are primarily interested in finding themselves rather than they're interested more in finding themselves than in getting to know the place and people. At least that's what the book suggests. And so the craze for Buddhism and the obsession with mountains are essentially the same phenomenon. And actually the book has a really compelling section on how Westerners turn Buddhism, which actually denies the existence of a fixed self, into this tool of self-therapy and self-discovery. It was all about self, and how the Buddhists, in response, actually especially Tibetan Buddhists, reimagined their religion to actually fulfill the quest of these Westerners. So it was like a two-way process. It was never a one-way process. So we learned that the famous Kopan Gomba in Bodha was actually established in 1969 at the initiative of a wealthy socialite who had led a glamorous life in Paris and New York, and then after being disillusioned with life, probably, decided to strike out on a spiritual path. So, and actually the main goal of establishing the monastery was to spread Buddhism in the West. And there's a section in the book that describes how this was done. So as Buddhism became more and more trendy among Westerners, the dharma tourism market also began to expand here. And now we know where it is at, right? We all know that like meditation and yoga and mindfulness is now a global industry worth billions of dollars. And in Nepal, there are companies that offer things like spiritual adventure tours and yoga treks and enlightened travel. So as Mark writes, what tourists think of as a quest is for Nepalis an industry. And for me, personally, this is one of the main takeaways from this book. In other words, for many Western tourists who come here, Nepal is just a screen on which they can project their longings. But it is not a passive screen. It is because Nepalis are adept at harnessing those longings, for their own purposes. So it is an encounter or two-way process. And this is, I think, something we constantly witness in Kathmandu and in other touristy areas of Nepal. And in fact, one of the reasons why this book resonated so strongly with me is because I have also constantly witnessed this. I trek. I have trekked in most of the commercial trekking routes across Nepal, and although I enjoy it, I always feel that there's something incongruous and something absurd about the whole experience. The way the romance of the mountains exists alongside this really crude commerce of the trekking industry. And so when I read this book, I felt like, oh wow, this book really hits the nail. And I felt like it really helped me make sense of my own experience. as a trekker. So I must also add how readable and engaging this book is, because I'm not sure if it's so easy to find an academic work that, I mean, I have come across so many academic works that can be written in such clear and jargon-free language. Whatever theory that Mark draws on is blended so seamlessly into his argument. Nothing seems extraneous or clunky. So, and the book is filled with really sharp, witty, and astute observations, which again goes on to prove that a serious academic book doesn't always have to be stripped of style. And for me, the book was also refreshing for another reason, and that is because most anthropological works on Nepal that I've come across, especially by Western academics, focus on a particular ethnic community in a rural setting, most or many, maybe. So, but this book, as well as Mark's previous two books, examine phenomena that we in Kathmandu are very much a part of. And it's really interesting to see our immediate milieu become the object of analysis, which was very different, I think, for me. And it's also remarkable how the book, manages to cover an entire cross-section of Kathmandu society in the course of analyzing, or exploring the history of tourism. So, for all these reasons and more, I think this book will be of interest not only to academics, but also to Nepali, this ordinary Nepali readers. We will all find many things that we will connect with in this book, and in fact, to anyone else who's interested in Nepal or in the encounter between foreigners and people in our part of the world. I think on that note, I think.
Thank you, Shradha ji, for a very succinct summary of what what the book contains, and for the additional commentary. People read this book, which means, I'm also adding, people should buy this book. I'm speaking now on behalf of the publishing organization. Thank you. Abhi Daiको पालो. Abhi Daile चाहिँ, we've agreed that he will speak briefly. So it's Abhi Dai, briefly.
When the hippies came to Kathmandu, they attracted my attention, and I became friends with very good friends, edited magazines together, traveled together, and one hippie girl taught me the Westland at the British Council Library, and I wrote a poem about her, which Mark has included in the book. And I had this association and worked with them in a very small, tiny Gaza-filled room, and got my head and so on. So that was a wonderful experience. One friend of mine, a poet, Glinka, Constance also he called himself, and he was a poet. I mostly worked with him and his friend Fiona. And I met Ira Cohen, उहाँको दरबारमा बस्थ्यो, गुरुज्यूहरूको दरबारमा. त्यसै कारणले उहाँले प्रकाशजी हिप्पीहरूलाई भेट्नुभयो क्या, Ira Cohen, and who left Nepal after Singha burned down, and he thought when Gaza was banned, Mahadev was sent the fire to burn Singha Darbar, so he left Nepal. He smoked the last puff. He smoked the last puff in 1974 or something, and he left Nepal. And all of them left, and Glinka, Constance was supposed to report to the Ministry of Home Affairs with haircut and proper jacket, etc., etc. And I cut his hair in a right size and a badly cut. And we found one tie and one usable jacket in my wardrobe, very few clothes. And then he went and he passed the test, and he came out very angry after that. And I said then goodbye at the GPO, and I returned crying like an empty person. I thinking that perhaps the world was empty for me. They had occupied my mind so much. And I kept hiding this experience for a long time. And when somebody came to talk to me about hippies, why does this man want to talk about hippies? And I didn't understand their mission properly, but I felt them, I didn't understand them. That's what I did. When Pratyush Bhai sent him to, and he gave Mark advice to meet me, I was still surprised, why is this wonderful academic is interested in the hippies? And I had not understood the hippies until this book came out. After this book came out, I understand fully what they had come for here. And this is the amazing book. Prakashji was also helping them with by writing books about how to go read with shoestring budget in Kathmandu. $2 ko dollar ma $2 rupees, $2 a day in Kathmandu, and that was a survival kit, and he wrote for them. And these were the great people, amazing people. And the final point is, when Mark went back to America and sent me two things. One, he discovered Glinka's, Constance, my friend Glinka's poem. I don't know where he is, I feel emotional. And when he sent the poems to me, I cried. I wept. And the second news he sent me was about the death of Ira Cohen. So this is how it is. And when this book came out in Pratyush Bhai, I knew him through Pratyush Bhai. He has been in association with him in Martin Chautari, so I met him that and I consider this publication of this very expensive book, very good book. In Nepal, I consider this as a great event, and this is a very readable book. As Shradha said, this is not only useful for academics but also for everybody. And after spending a long time as an academic, the second avatar of an academic is a non-academic. I am non-academic now.
We listened to a lot of notions of Nepal in this land with mountains, yet he was not. And I always felt oh, this is so absurd, something that's so normal, this is so exotified. And as a reader, I really felt, the Nepali perspective was also matching to my perspective. Nepali perspective. Also, Abhiji's insights in the book really, really wonderful. One thing that really struck me was most hippies did not even try to learn Nepali, or even Newari, people that you stay with, most of the Newari. That really struck me how much of a self-fulfilling project this whole notion of coming to Nepal and discovering oneself was. Also, I had a question to Mark. So can you talk a little bit about your positionality as, a Western white academic coming to Nepal doing this research, and how that affected the research, talking to first hippies, mostly Western hippies, but also local Nepalis. What was the different interaction? I guess changes everything.
Last month, पढ़ाई सोध्यो पढ़ाई सोध्यो
my positionality, I think the fact that I'm a white Westerner has different implications in different contexts. Okay, I'll try to be loud. Yeah, I think my foreignness has different implications depending on who I'm talking to. And I think in many cases, being a foreigner can be an advantage, and in other cases it can be a disadvantage. It can be an advantage if and when you find someone for whom, as Abhi suggested, their own personal experiences may be something that they don't feel comfortable sharing with other Nepalis, or that they think other people will misunderstand. When they find an outsider asking questions that are meaningful, sometimes it's like opening a flood, just memories come pouring out, and it's a wonderful experience, I hope, for both me and the person sharing their experiences with me. On the other hand, there are other instances, I think, where being a foreigner may shade the ways in which people respond to questions. And this is one of the primary reasons why I worked with several Nepali co-researchers. And in particular, the chapter 9 of this book, which is on the Nepali experience of the hippie era, that chapter draws heavily on the work that was done by those two people, Ram Tiwari and Rashmi Shela, who unfortunately I don't think Ram is here. I know Rashmi is not. They did fantastic work. But my point is that the same question coming from my mouth and coming from their mouth would produce different answers, and I greatly valued the answers that they got, because they were much more candid, much more open. And maybe I just also want to say that in addition to those two, this book was based on the incredible generosity of dozens, hundreds of Nepalis, including these two men especially. And so I'm very grateful for that.
To share an experience, I conducted a research in Bali, and I came with some interesting findings. It was interesting for me, but I would like to just share this and like to know if we have come across similar kind of things about tourism in Kathmandu. In Bali, I came across with the notion that the tourists of the contemporary times are compared with the tourists of the early times, and the tourists of the contemporary times can't experience the genuine culture, genuine art. That's what it is taken for, and the tourists of the early times have that genuine experience. And then tourists of the contemporary times are also compared with expatriates, and expatriates have, because they visit frequently and stay a longer time, they have greater understanding of local culture. That contemporary tourists are also compared with locals and with the anthropologists as well. So the contemporary tourists are given a very marginalized position in that, the general trend, in the critical trend. But it is these very contemporary tourists who go for what the anthropologists have written about the culture, they go for what the earlier tourists have produced, takes on that culture, they go for to the locals. So, I mean, it was quite amazing. I just conducted a 8-9 months long research in Ubud and came up with interesting findings. I mean, I'm not advertising my work, but I just want to know if you came up with such a finding.
I mean, I think I did see something similar, and the danger is to romanticize an earlier period, but I think there are significant differences between the early kind of wave of tourists in Nepal and probably in Bali. In fact, they were probably the same people, and those that came later. And one of the things that Shradha touched on is the emergence of guidebooks. Up until a certain point, people arrived in Nepal knowing almost nothing, except for the kind of vague romantic images that they had. They didn't have a book telling them, this is what that is, and and I think because of that reason, they were more open, they were more inquiring, and I hear this from both tourists who were here at this time, at the early period, and from the people that interacted with them in Nepal. The Nepalis also remember that earlier group as more curious, more friendly, more open, and frankly, also they had more time. And I think this is the other big difference, that for a variety of complicated reasons, the people that were here in the hippie era tended to, as Shradha said, be time-rich and cash-poor in the early period, and then that reverses later on. And so the adventure tourists, they come having read a bunch of guidebooks, and also they come having been warned that you better watch out or someone will take advantage of you. And so they're always on their guard, and when someone approaches them, they assume that approach has to do with money. And again, I think humans always are nostalgic and think that things used to be better. So there's certainly an element of that in this story, but I do think there's an element of truth as well, and if that makes sense.
My name is Tribhuvan. I am a student. My question is quite personal. I want to know how your love for Nepal has grown over these years, and what inspires you to work here in Nepal.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
He has used the word love.
Yeah. As a child, as was mentioned, I was able to visit Nepal, but I also spent a number of years living in India. And at a certain point, as a young adult, I decided that I wanted a career that would allow me to maintain relationships with South Asia. And at that time, I had a choice. I went into anthropology. I could choose India or Nepal. As many tourists have observed, Nepal is so much more pleasant than India. It's so true, yes. There's more here to love. I mean, India is a wonderful place, but as we say, it's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to stay there. Whereas Nepal has always been, for me, number one, an easier place to be a foreigner. It has been more welcoming, and it just, as I think of it in terms of scale, the scale of India is overwhelming. The scale of Nepal is human, and that makes it such a much more pleasant place to be. I don't know if that.
Won't you mention some of your friends, man?
Yes.
Who make you count all the time? एक दुईवटा अर्को प्रश्न लिउँ 6:15 मा I really want to close the formal session. अरु एउटा पनि प्रश्न छैन के पनि? Yes, please.
This question might be a little out of context, but where did the concept of the cover come from?
This is a watercolor by Desmond Doig.
I know that.
You know, and the press asked me if I had suggestions for cover art, and I sent this, and we were very fortunate that, of course, Desmond Doig has long since passed away, but his partner Dubhi Bhagat, we contacted him to ask for permission to reprint. And he very, very generously said, yes, just send me a copy. So no charge, just send me a copy of the book. 2 months later, he died.
It's of a personal interest for me because now I own the thing.
You do? I would like to see it.
Okay, yes, please.
I haven't read your book.
You need to introduce yourself.
My name is Dorje Grun. I haven't read the book, and I don't know if you've made a commentary or even a reference to how or in what ways tourism has benefited the country and in ways it hasn't or has had negative impacts. Have you? Or could you share that with us?
I have not gone into that, what I would think of as more kind of development discourse and the role of tourism, especially in rural areas. I mean, I do try to suggest that tourism in various ways had economic impacts on the Kathmandu Valley in particular. But for better or worse, you'll find, if you choose to read it, that the book focuses mainly on Kathmandu, with the exception of a chapter on the development of Chitwan. So I do not follow, for example, I don't follow trekkers out into the rural areas to look at the impacts and those kinds of things. So I haven't really gone into those questions of the pluses and minuses. More, it's an effort to document and analyze the emergence.
Yes, please.
My name is Itza. I have bought your book. My question is regarding how this phenomenon or the whole tourism movement that has happened since the 1950s in Nepal affected or influenced the Nepali identity or what it means to be a Nepali, especially when I think about, like, I just read your back summary and how this romanticized idea of the mountain encouraged hippies to come here, but now when we look at our own currencies, the mountain is in our currency, so it has like directly translated to our national identity. So have you made a comment on that?
I have not, and I don't feel qualified to do that. I think you should do that. Seriously, someone should ask those questions and explore them and come up with answers.
Maybe in the realm of other questions, but I'm fascinated. I know this is a historical account, and this is a historical anthropology. But in the contemporary setting, I'm curious if you have any preliminary thoughts, and this is kind of a research question I think maybe some others here will take up. It's not my research question, but I think it's interesting. Do you have any preliminary thoughts on the current wave of, say, rising middle class in other countries of Asia, the way that tourism is changing in Nepal, and the way in which there's perhaps new kinds of Dharma tourism, and new kinds of golden age of different variety? And if you have any preliminary thoughts on the difference between this boom in Western tourism, what's happening maybe currently, a contemporary boom in Asian tourism?
Student who's doing that dissertation.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, for people who haven't looked at the book yet, for a variety of reasons, I stopped the story around 1980, and with a few exceptions. But I do not go into the contemporary scene because I felt like the origins of this book was not really to explain tourism per se, but to answer questions that I had myself. That I wrote the book because for decades I looked for this book, that I wanted to read this book, and it didn't exist. So eventually I wrote it, and so this is an example of me fulfilling my own narrow, scratching my own itch, as we say, and the parts that I were the most interested in are the parts I deal with here. Someone else should write the next several volumes. And lastly, before we stop, I want to mention that I am not receiving any royalties. I'm getting no money from the sales of these books. It's all going to Martin Chautari. So buy plenty, right?
Thank you, Mike. Before I end, I have two announcements. One is, of course, the book is being sold by our colleagues. It's being sold for 700 rupees today. The book's already available in Mandala Book Point. It'll be available in other major bookstores by the end of this week. Secondly, Mike probably doesn't know this. We have arranged a chair for him in the garden where he'll be sitting and signing. Did you know that? No. So he now knows that. And thirdly, I really encourage you to read these chapters. Shradha mentioned the chapter about the much written about Boris. There are other characters who I had not heard of, but whose lives are documented here. There is a character called John Kaufman, who Mark also calls Jonga Bahadur Pop Singer.
He calls himself.
He calls himself, sorry. We had actually wanted to publish this chapter in its long version in Sinas way before, but external reviewers advised the journal's editors and the author that if it were to be published at that time, when the characters described in the book, in the chapter, were still alive, Mark and the journal might be the subject of lawsuits. So although it was a very fine chapter, we decided to just shelve it for many years. And the long version was only published, I believe, in 2015.
After his death.
After this particular character had died. So I really recommend that you read the, of course you have to read the whole book, but specific chapters are very interesting. So, अन्तमा तपाईहरु सबै साँझ पनि यति समयसम्म बस्दिनु भएकोमा धन्यवाद। हाम्रो मार्टिन चौतारी सुहाउँदो साधारण चिया र नट फर प्रफिट कुकिज त्यहाँ बाहिर छ भन्ने सूचना छ र किताब चाहिँ उता छ सबैलाई धन्यवाद तपाईँले
Just a few days. I've been here a while, but I'm leaving.
यो तपाईँलाई